May the words of my mouth and the meditation of our hearts be always acceptable in your sight, O Lord, our strength and our Redeemer. Amen. You and I are to be salt and light. If that disappoints you, you were hoping for something, perhaps a spice like garlic or something else. I understand that. Light is more easily understood in some ways, how we are to be people of light. I've sometimes imagined what it must have been like to be those very early human beings before they discovered how to create fire. Can you imagine how terrifying every night must have been? Because our vision is not very good. Many animals, especially many predatory animals, have very good night vision. We know that the very first human beings were on the continent of Africa, where all of the present predators are currently there, and some very scary predators that are no longer there were also there for our earliest ancestors. What a terrible thing it must have been to have to live half of every day in darkness. Light brings it possible for us to learn, to observe, to protect ourselves. We talk about being enlightened, which is another way of having light cast on a subject so we understand it. Light is so very important, and yet, don't we all take it for granted? We have all, even someone as old as myself, have grown up in a culture in which all I have ever needed to do my whole life is go over and flick on a switch or turn on a switch. And of course, there have been occasions, and some of you might actually have had this occasion yesterday, because I understand parts of the city of Baltimore were without power for a short period of time. It's always disconcerting when we don't have electricity to turn on the light, but we take these things for granted. Salt as well. Light, in the sense of electricity, is not that inexpensive, but salt, as somebody who goes to the grocery store and does the grocery shopping, salt is about the cheapest thing you can buy these days. And yes, it's up to about $1.25 a pound, but it was down to 99 cents a few years ago. You know, it's still not, nobody is going without salt because they can't afford it. I want to think a little bit about salt. Maybe I'm hung up about it because of my own history, but I grew up in a household where my mother was in a long line of old New England farming cooks, which was not a good recommendation. She, her concept of everything, which she inherited from her parents and grandparents, was to put everything in a pot and boil it to death. And I mean really to death. But on top of that, my grandmother lived with us, and about the time I was born, the doctors decided because of her severe asthma, she needed to be on a low-salt diet. So my mother, in addition to cooking everything to death, never used salt, garlic, onion, thyme, dill. None of those things existed in our house. Nothing was put in except the water to boil everything. And it's hard to believe now, but I was actually a painfully skinny boy. Oh, those were the good old days. But I was carted off to doctors for a 2-year period. My parents kept taking me to doctors because they couldn't understand why I couldn't gain any weight. But none of the doctors ever asked me, does food taste good to you? I mean, that would have solved the whole problem, but I was just a kid. What did I know? But no, it didn't. And I occasionally was able to have lunch or dinner with friends, and that food always tasted so much better. And one day I came home from our next door neighbor was my best friend, and his parents were my parents' best friends. And I came home and I said in all seriousness to my mother, who was a good mother. She was not a good cook, but she was a very good mother. I said to her very seriously, how come you don't make good, nourishing food like Mrs. Matz? And my mother decided that this was hysterically funny, which really offended me as a kid because I was dead serious. I mean almost dead serious. I just didn't understand why food at home tasted so bad. And my mother never answered that question, but she regaled company, and she told, of course, Mrs. Matz. And so in both families, even to this day, as Nancy can attest, whenever people from those families get together, the subject of my why don't you make good, nourishing food like Mrs. Matz comes up to haunt me. I was the only person I know who gained 20 pounds in college because I loved college food. It actually tasted good. Everyone else complained. But that's a bit of a diversion about salt. But if you haven't thought about it lately, and if you can see I've obsessed about salt, if you haven't thought about salt lately, it is really an important item. It brings out the taste in so many foods. It makes, I can assure you, a huge difference. And so while it seems that Jesus is asking us to make a little tiny difference, in fact, it's a big difference. It's to add some real zest and some real taste to life. And light, of course, is important because it sheds God's light on dark passages. It lifts up the sin and deplorable things that happen in our world to be exposed in the light so that we can move beyond them. In Isaiah, the prophet mentions that the people are bewildered. They're making appropriate sacrifices and they're doing their usual liturgies, but they feel like God has abandoned them. And speaking for God, Isaiah says, well, there's a reason for this, because even when you're doing your sacrificial services, you're really not thinking about me or about doing good. You're thinking about your own self-aggrandizement. The importance of sacrifice is to raise up those who have fallen, to be mindful of the poor and to alleviate them, to come to the aid of your neighbors who have need, to lift the oppression from those who are oppressed. This is what God expects. And that's the kind of light we are to show. I won't ask for a show of hands, but I hope most of you have had a chance to, in the passages that were sent out on Thursday from the Cathedral, to go to the Dean's message, which actually turns out to be a message from Bishop Carey and a number of other bishops, about 15 bishops in total, who were part of a project where I was also involved of getting bishops to respond to the abuses of our federal government as relates to its actions of ICE. And so I hope that if you haven't gone on and watched that, you will. It is also fair to say that earlier in the week, if you're on the diocesan mailing list, the whole two-page statement signed by 154 Episcopal bishops went out to everyone, which is very critical of ICE, not from a political perspective, but from a moral perspective. It praises, and we should this day praise the people who live in areas where ICE has been particularly active. And I think especially in Minneapolis-St. Paul. Thankful for the many, many people who are making their Christian witness by going out into streets that are even colder than the cold that we're experiencing here and standing to protest abuses. And there are no dearth of abuses. But before I get into that, I want to make one thing clear. I think most Americans are in agreement that we need to radically reform our policies relative to immigration. We've needed to do that for over 30 years, and neither of our political parties have really led us to do that. It's been easier for each of them to blame the other for why there's no improvement. So there is a need to get more serious about how to do immigration well. There's also, I think, almost no difference of opinion among Americans about the fact that if you are illegal in this country and you commit a crime, you need to be charged with that crime, and very likely you need to be exported or sent back to the country of your origin. But you know, statistically, almost none of the crimes committed in America are committed by people who have come from another country. Almost none. Almost all of our crimes are committed by American citizens. But ICE operates as if it has a complete license to just round up people. Its abuses are obvious. Anyone who has seen television is aware that the murder of two people, which was clearly murder and not in any way justified, is there for everyone to see, and yet these people are still being, that is, the perpetrators, are still being protected. The bishops are particularly critical of the fact that ICE operates as if one did not have to pay attention to the law. In this country, it is unlawful to enter somebody's house, to enter a school, to enter a church without the proper documentation giving them permission to do that. But ICE doesn't pay any attention to that. The rule of law makes no difference. There has never been in our history, never, an organization of persons supposed to protect us in the law, wearing masks and not being identified. This is not a case of sane crowd control. This is clearly an abuse of power. These are the things that your bishops have decried. The treatment of others also in the sense of racial profiling, which clearly is going on. But there are bright spots in many places. You may have heard that on Thursday, the authorities of Howard County decided decisively not to grant a permit so that a piece of property could be sold to build a concentration camp, essentially, for ICE. You may not have heard that in Hanover County in Virginia, which is just north of Richmond, hundreds of people showed up at a county meeting to protest the fact that there was a large warehouse that was going to be sold as an ICE detention center. And they were so vehement that halfway through, the powers that be in the county decided, all right, this is a decisive issue. We are not allowing them to buy that property. They didn't even finish the meeting. It was so obvious that people were so upset about this. This is a way of being salt and light, as are the protests in many other places. As far away as Oklahoma, and in an area where you might not expect it, there also in the past week was a huge gathering of people to protest an ICE detention center in their area. And it's not because they don't want a detention center, it's because they understand that what happens in these detention centers are inhuman. Most recently, you may have heard, last night I heard this on the news, that that adorable little boy who was essentially kidnapped by ICE, the one with the blue bunny hat that has been in the news and has now safely been returned, they are now bringing charges and are trying to export him. This is not Christian behavior, and it is behavior that cannot be tolerated by Christians. You and I have a responsibility to shed light on this situation. More power to those who object to the ways in which people are being treated a very different way than they've ever been treated in our country before. We need to recognize that many lines have been crossed, and the lines that have been crossed call us all to make our witness. Now, protesting may not be something that all of you are comfortable with, but there are lots of ways to witness to the power of love and to be salt and light in your situation, to talk about these circumstances with your neighbors and your friends, to make it clear that your Christian values call you to a higher morality and need to call out the various ways in which immoral things are being done here at home that no one should stand idly by and let happen. Finally, it seems to me that this is an important part of Matthew's gospel. Last week we had the very beginning of the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes. This is the very next passage that runs into. Now, I hope you all know that the Sermon on the Mount was not a sermon. Jesus was a far better preacher than that, and a far better preacher than me. But this is a compilation of various things that Jesus was teaching, and the compilation was arranged by the writer of Matthew's Gospel. And the fact that we are salt and light was the very first group of commandments that we run into after we hear what blessed action is like in the Beatitudes. That says volumes as to how important this is in the life of the church and in the life of Christ. Doing good to our neighbor, raising up the fallen, being merciful and just. These are the things that God requires in all times and in all places.